Here's a switch rod. This happens to be an 8-weight, which would be the anadromous side of a switch rod. Think steelhead, think, although not overgunned for trout, because none of these are even at 7 or 8 weight. And I've got what's called a switch line on it. And the name switch line largely would connotate the idea, well, you could fish it with single hand or two hands, you can do whatever you want. But it largely is a focused nymph setup. Okay, now I can spey cast with this to some degree. That being that, yeah, I can throw a nice little single spey, particularly at short to moderate range. What's short to moderate range? Let's call it 30 to 60 feet. And, you know, Marty talked about the Deschutes. He talked about first thing in the morning. He talked about the evening. He talked about prime time. So this switch line, while it's not a great spey line, it's a sufficient spey line, particularly for those prime buckets of period, morning, evening. But where these lines really excel is in the nymph game, because you've got this mendability with this thing. You can just watch the mendability, and if you're fishing bozo the bobber, or as we used to say in Alaska, when bozo goes down, you go up. These lines work fabulous for that, because they're upwards of 50 feet of body where you can just mend and just mend, and you know, you basically got the center pin of a fly rod going on. So they work nicely with that line for them. One of the big misnomers with these switch rods is, I want to get one line that does it all. Not happening. It's not happening. A switch rod in the hands of somebody in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon or Washington, even British Columbia is a good example. If you're going to nymph fish a whole bunch, which a lot of people buy switch rods, they don't necessarily buy them thinking that's what they're going to do, but they end up being nymphaholics. See Rogue River, for example. You're going to probably have a switch line, so you've got a focused nymph setup. And then you might also use it as a true swing stick, which I'm going to grab a different one in a minute and talk about. In that case, you might have a Skagit short on it, or a steelhead Scandi, or a Scandi short Versi tip. And then it becomes basically a baby spey rod. But if you live up in Washington State, the one fishery that Washington's got on Oregon, it's the only fishery Washington's got on Oregon, is we got this thing called Puget Sound. And the beaches of Puget Sound offer some really interesting opportunity. Sea run cutthroats, resonant silvers, migratory silvers, chum salmon, even king salmon at times, right off the beaches. Sea run dollies, and even steelhead up on Whidbey as an example. In addition to the beach game, you've got a very interesting use of a switch rod as a lake fishing tool for lakes. Why? Because you can throw mega far. And when you can throw mega far with Mr. Woolly Bugger doing his work detail, and yeah, you can take this thing and single-handed way out there and fish, you know, streamers or fish chronomids or whatever you're doing lake fishing, but think of the coverage. And this one, you know, these ones that are 11 to 11 and a half foot are pretty single-handable. You know, once they get about past 11 and a half, and you do this all day, you're probably going to have yourself an appointment for Tommy John surgery. But up until then, you can play that game. So lakes, beaches, nymph fishing, standard type of swing fishing for the various fish like steelhead. So there's kind of an intro to the switch rod. But understand, it won't be a one line does all thing, because you'll be compromised in one theater of operation or another. This right here, yes, here's one of the new one switch rods. Try one here this weekend. Do it. I'll tell you why to do it, honestly. I've been with Sage since 1987. I've seen, either as a retailer in the 80s, or at Sage in-house, or a rep. I've seen every introduction of everything. And these rods are truly a quantum jump over things. This is a 11-foot 6/7 weight switch rod. I kind of call it the baby spey. And the 7-weight switch, regardless of length, is your 30-06 of switch. It'll do everything. It's big enough for the anadromous game, but it's not overkill on Trouty Trouterson. This one happens to have a Scandi Short Versi tip on it, which is a very nice casting line on these type of rods, very smooth. That cast was obviously executed with as a two-handed cast. There's a Snap Z foam, effortless stuff, throwing 3/4 of the way across, not even trying. The other thing that folks can learn to get really good at, and there's some river systems in this state that really, this comes in super handy. The North Umpqua being a fabulous example. Sometimes the Umpqua seems like an obvious Spey target, but sometimes it's actually a better single-handed target. And if you've ever had the pleasure watching Frank Moore down in that country, or Joe Howe, those two guys. Those guys are the dean. They are the senior spokesman of the Umpqua. Those guys have done a huge amount of damage with rods like 10-foot 9 weights, 9100s, in both Loomis and Sage configurations. So oftentimes these switchies get really interesting to use like that, where I've got this type of line, this Scandi Short Versi tip, but I'm playing it as a single-handed affair. So here's a single Spey with the haul. Now you can well imagine in a lot of stretches in the Umpqua that cast would be on the other side. But if you got Douglas, 100-year Douglas fir behind you, you may not even really have a true D-loop position. Whereas with this, that D-loop really wasn't even behind me. So you can play that game with these really nicely as a single-handed Spey rod, truly. Okay?